In this video, we're going to look at how to write a technical process description. This should be a little bit easier than when we learned how to write a product description, just because we've already done a product description and some of the things here are very similar, but there are also some key differences. So the outcomes in this video are to recognize the correct organization of a process description, identify the key components, to organize the information properly, to be able to write a complete introduction, to be able to describe the stages in the process, and to write a conclusion. So first, let's talk about what we mean by process. A process is a series of actions or steps that are taken in order to achieve a particular end. And that could be making a cup of coffee, changing the tire on a car, applying for college. Any series of actions or steps that are aimed at achieving a particular goal, we can call that a process. Now, a process description is a general step-by-step description of how a process happens. And this is an important point. In a process description, we are not telling the reader what to do. We are telling them how something happens. We are not giving the reader instructions. We're not saying first do this, then do that. We are telling them how something happens, because sometimes the process that we're describing, the reader doesn't actually have to do anything. It's a process that happens on its own. And this is important because when you're writing a process description, you need to use passive voice. We can't use the imperative where we say do this and do that. We have to use passive voice, which we talked about previously. So just like a product description, a process description consists of some important parts that you must have. The first one is the title. And the title should clearly state exactly what the topic of your process description is. And importantly, the title of a process description should always start with the word how. And here we have an example, how wind turbines provide electrical energy. So as we said, a process description describes how something happens. So the title should always start with that word, how. Next, you have the introduction. And just like we did in a product description, the introduction is going to give your audience some information that they need to understand the rest of the process description. And there are some parts here which are very similar to the introduction of a product description. There are some parts that are the same, some parts that are very similar, and some parts that are new. So when you are writing the introduction of a process description, you will start with a definition. You will define the process that you are describing. And then you will give your intended audience. And just like in a product description, the intended audience here is the intended audience for your description. Then something new, which is prior knowledge. Prior knowledge is anything that you expect your reader to know before they read your process description. So it's something that they need to know to understand the process, but you're not going to explain it to them. You expect them to know that before they start reading your process description. Then we have a brief overview, and this is basically like a general description for the process. 2 or 3 sentences that sum up the whole process. Then special conditions. This is another one of the new things. This is something that conditions that you must have in order for the process to work, but they are not actually part of the process. So an example of this might be if you wanted to register for a website. In order to do that, you would have to have a working internet connection. But having a working internet connection is not part of the process. Another example might be the process of applying for college. In order to apply for college, you have to have graduated high school, but it's not part of the process, but it is a special condition. So in order to complete the process of applying for college, you must have graduated high school. Once you've gone through special conditions, you can then explain special terms. These are words that you're going to use in your process description, in your description of the stages, that you think the reader may not know. So you're going to explain the meaning of those words in the introduction rather than doing it in the description of the stages. And then lastly, just a list, the preview of the stages. Just like we did in a product description, we listed the major parts. Here, you're listing the major stages. And here we have an example of what an introduction should look like. So we start with a definition. Here, the process we're using is how a wind turbine generates electricity. So we start by defining a wind turbine. Then we have our intended audience. Then we have the prior knowledge, things that we expect the reader to know before they read our description. Then the brief overview, just a couple of sentences summing up the whole process. Then the special conditions, things that must be in place in order for the process to work. Then the special terms. We don't have to do anything here except just give the term and the definition, and then a list of the major stages. So once you've completed the introduction, you then get on to the description of the major stages. Now, if you remember in the product description video, we said that you treat each major part of the product like a product in itself, and you describe that major part. Similarly here, each stage of a process is in itself a mini process. So the description of each stage should be a miniature process description. So if, for example, you are describing a process that has 4 major stages, you will write 4 tiny process descriptions for each stage, and then when you put those 4 together, you have one huge process description for the whole process. And for each stage, you need to provide the following. The first is a definition. Again, what you're defining here is the stage, not the whole process, but the stage of the process. And you're going to define it by simply saying, this is the stage of the process at which, and then you're going to say what happens in this stage. Then you're going to mention any special conditions. Again, this is special conditions for this stage of the process, not for the process overall, but for this stage of the process. And then you will just go through the steps of this stage. So each stage is made up of a series of steps, and here you'll go through them one by one. So your description of major stages should look something like this. You start just with a sentence at the beginning, which reminds the reader what the major stages are. And then you have a heading for the name of the stage, and then you will give a definition of the stage. You will say that this is the stage of the process at which, and then you'll explain what happens. Then you go through the different steps of that stage one by one. And it's important here to make sure that you use sequence words to show that you are describing a process and to separate the different steps out. So you can see here, I've used sequence words at the beginning of every sentence. And it doesn't just have to be first, second, third, fourth. You can use words like next, then, after that, finally, lastly, but make sure you start each sentence with a sequence word to show clearly where each step begins. Then once you've described each stage, you then go on to your conclusion. And in the conclusion, all you want to do is review the main points from the process description, and then also give a little bit of additional information, just like we did in a product description. So you start with a summary, where you will summarize the main stages, what the main stages of the process were. Then you will go through a complete cycle of the process, make a complete cycle of the process, where you will give the reader a brief reminder of what happened in the different stages. And then lastly, you will tell the reader where they can go to get more information if they need it. So your conclusion will look like this. First, you will just remind the reader what the 3 or 4 stages of your process were. and then you will write a brief reminder. And basically here, what you want to do is take each stage of the process and summarize that whole stage in one sentence. So if you describe a 3-stage process, you want to summarize it in 3 sentences. A 4-stage process, you want to try and summarize it in 4 sentences. So 1 sentence for each stage of the process. And then lastly, you just tell the reader where they need to go to get more information. One final point about visuals. We are describing a process here. So it's important when you use visuals in your process description to make sure that those visuals actually show the process. If you are writing a process description like we have here of how a wind turbine generates electricity, it's no good to just give a picture of a wind turbine. You need to give a picture that actually shows how the process works. So to review, your title should always start with the word how. Your introduction gives a lot of background information about the process, explains any special conditions, any special terms, and any prior knowledge you expect your reader to have before they read your process description. Then you go through each stage of the process, making sure you use sequence words at the start of each sentence and making sure you describe it in the passive voice. And your conclusion is just a brief summary where you're trying to take each stage of the process and cut it down to 1 sentence, and then make sure that the visuals you use actually illustrate the process and is not just a picture of a machine or a device. That's the end of the lesson.